Well, it's a little after 2 o'clock, and we have a number of folks who've just come in to attend. I want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining today. I'm Gene Barres, and I'm the Executive Director of the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and I'll be moderating today's conversation on prioritizing parent mental health. I want to thank the JED Foundation for collaborating on this special webinar. JED and the Clay Center have overlapping missions dedicated to mental health education for the prevention and intervention of mental health challenges among young people. Now, joining me today, I'll introduce our panelists, are Nance Roy, who's Chief Clinical Officer at the JED Foundation. Welcome, Nance.
Thanks for having me, Eugene.
And Khadijah Booth Watkins, who's Associate Director at the Clay Center. Welcome, Khadijah.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So a few housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and a full transcript will be of the conversation will be available after the webinar. The webinar is for educational purposes, so it's not a substitute for medical advice, for diagnosis, or for treatment. And as a reminder is always to seek the advice of your physician or another qualified health professional with any questions you have about a medical concern, including mental health concerns. Finally, we're working on a parent support resources list that we'll share following the webinar. And this will include any resources that we've shared today in the chat. So let's get started. First and foremost, all of us at JED and at the Clay Center want to take a moment to just acknowledge the toll, the mental health toll that this pandemic has taken on parents and caregivers in particular. It's not a normal lift for any of us to carry such a burden for such an extended period of time. And it's important for us to acknowledge and say out loud, normalize this as a truth. Humans are not built to be doing what we're doing over the last year. I mean, we're pack animals. We need each other. We need relationships. And while the screen is a substitute, it's no substitute for being able to give each other a hug or, be with each other in real time. Nor is it for our kids. So while we all need to continue to get through this, we all want to validate anything you may be feeling emotionally struggling in the day-to-day process of this. And we hope that we can give you some guidance to make it more manageable. But some things I hope you'll take away from this conversation, and I'll be real brief as an intro. First of all, this is all about self-care for parents and caregivers. And self-care is not selfish. As parents and caregivers, we're struggling with burnout, with feeling overwhelmed, anxiety, depression has increased. It's been really difficult to take care of ourselves, to take care of our families, help our kids in remote learning, to work, whether we're essential workers and going in and being faced with being exposed to the virus, or working remotely and having to juggle and balance a whole number of things. When this began, many of us, myself included, thought, hey, this is last March, this is going to be like a snow day. Well, it's been more than just a snow day. But one of the most important principles of parent and caregiver self-care, it's like what the flight attendant says when you get on an airplane, and that is when the pressure drops, if the pressure drops, put the oxygen mask on yourself first and then help the person next to you. So it's really important that we take care of ourselves, and to do so, there are a number of things that we can do, and we'll be talking a lot about self-care, such as meditation, yoga, exercise, diet, taking breaks, listening to music, doing whatever relaxes yourself. And remember that our youngest kids, all of our kids, pick up on our anxieties and our stress, but there are ways of managing it. So taking time to do something for yourself and setting your priorities and setting your limitations can be really important. So it's a matter of recognizing that mental health is important and that our mental health is absolutely vital for taking care of our kids and our other family members. So some signs that you need to look for: if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling depressed, if your fuse is shortened, if you find yourself like yelling at members of your household, if you can't sleep, if you are having physical complaints, if you're feeling on edge, there are a number of signs. If you're lacking in empathy, there are a lot of signs of burnout that are evident. So be aware of those signs and others that we'll learn about today. And if you notice some warning signs, then there are many ways of managing it, and hopefully we'll address some of those issues today. So let's get started, and we'll start with with your questions. I want to start with for the three of us with questions that we've found most common or relevant in our own clinical practices. For me, I've heard from so many parents, how can I help my partner's mental health too? It's not just me. Um, and I think there are many answers to this, but one way of doing it is consider this like a tag team. Consider passing the baton. Work things out. Talk with your partner about what each of your needs are, about where you're stressed. Have conversations. You can't just assume that you're both stressed and you're both going to handle things together. You may need to set schedules. You may need to set priorities. You may need to decide, who's going to do the homeschooling if homeschooling is necessary. You may need to decide who's going to order the food if you have it brought to you, or who's going to go out and get it. There are so many things that we have to do that it's really important, I think, to share the everyday tasks, but it's also very important to ask your partner about what's causing the greatest stresses and what would help them the most. So is it going to be social contact, even if it's over Zoom, with a family member, or if it's being in touch with a primary care physician or a mental health counselor if they need it. But talk with each other, have frequent conversations, and be sure that you're keeping your finger on your own pulse, but also on your partner's pulse. And it's a whole other separate issue, which we can get into later if you're a single parent at home with your kids. So that's what I've been hearing as a major challenge. So Nance, anything that rises to the top in your clinical practice?
Yeah, so let me first just clarify about the JED Foundation. We are not direct clinical care to patients. Rather, we are a foundation that works to promote the emotional well-being of teens and young adults toward the end of presenting suicide and significant substance misuse. And in so doing, we work a lot with schools, high schools, and colleges, and also focus on parents and now also the workplace, faculty, staff, and employees. So, as we've been hearing more and more from parents through our outreach type work, less so direct clinical service, certainly many of the things that you mentioned in terms of, I guess I would think about how do you manage conflict or potential issues that may emerge, whether it's between partners or caregivers or what have you. And one of the things that I think all of the things you said certainly ring true. And one additional thing I would add in that regard is thinking about planning ahead. So rather than waiting until an issue emerges, thinking, having a conversation in advance. You mentioned, who's going to do what, having a schedule, all of those things, but can you do that so that in the moment you're not having to make, certainly there will be some times where you have to make instant decisions, but is there a way to plan and sort of set rules? And we also know, whether it's during COVID or any other point, if you do have two caregivers involved, you're not always going to agree on the right answer or how to manage something with a child. And so having that conversation in advance and then agreeing that even if it might not be your particular choice of how to handle that, to support that decision, and have those kinds of conversations in advance so they're not having to occur in a conflictual way in front of the kids all the time in the moment. And also, you mentioned having a pulse on each other's sort of point of view and feeling. I would also say to validate each other's feelings, because I think, I may be feeling angry about something, but the person I'm living with may be feeling sad about the same thing. And so we will have different emotional reactions to things, and being able to validate each other's feelings can also go a long way, even if it's not the same thing that you're feeling. So in terms of what you talked about, those were just a couple of things I would add. We can talk, in a minute. I'd like Khadijah to be able to talk about some things you can do as well, some strategies for self-care, and how to make this a more manageable time. But I'll stop for now.
That's great. And in terms of resources, we do have a blog on the positive value of conflict and some tips on how to deal with conflict, at home in one's family.
And
Khadijah.
I'm just going to interject for 1 second. I will say that in the chat, we're also listing resources. So there's a fair amount listed already. I don't think what's included yet is on the JED website. There is tips, especially around COVID, for parents, for students, for educators. So that's another resource as well.
Great. Khadijah, what's risen to the top in your clinical practice?
So in normal times, parenting can be challenging, and then you toss in that we're abruptly thrown together for like a year and complete obliteration of our schedules and routines. The global pandemic, the reckoning on race, and the near civil war, it's a lot. So what I am more so observing, not so much as a question, is parents are feeling incredibly stressed and overwhelmed and feeling like they need to do it all. And so what I find myself doing is offering advice or suggestions around just giving yourself a break. Try to refrain from judgment, be kind to yourself, take a minute and breathe. So not so much a question, but it's an observation that I have of most parents that come into my office.
I totally second that, Khadijah. I mean, not only giving yourself a break, but letting yourself know you're enough. What you're doing is enough.
Right.
And just like we talk so much about young people comparing themselves to one another, especially on social media and the like, to try and avoid doing that as parents or caregivers. So-and-so seems like they're doing so much better, managing parenting than I am. I mean, the likelihood is they're probably not. So also to try and avoid comparison.
Yeah, that's tough.
Well, none of this is easy. So we have some questions. And the first is, can you share a short and effective breathing exercise for preventative care? If you guys can't, I can.
There's so many, Gene. Why don't you go for it?
Well, no, I mean, look, what I would suggest to folks, and this will appear on the resource list. Mindful, breathing exercises are in large part of all mindful meditation. We actually had a podcast at the Clay Center with Darshan Mehta, who is the medical director of the Benson Henry Mind Body Institute. And during that podcast, he actually gave a 5-minute example of a breathing exercise. But the whole notion of meditation, whether it's mindful meditation or transcendental meditation or yoga or biofeedback, it's all a combination of focused concentration, like when you're breathing, and body relaxation. And when you combine focus with relaxation, your brain emits alpha waves, and you really create structural changes in the brain. So the examples, there are some apps that are very popular. Some, the most common ones that folks use are Headspace, Calm, Breathe. If you go online, you'll find one. And you can use apps, or you can use a technique that Dr. Mehta did for the Clay Center. But the trick is to practice every day. And even if you take a minute in between appointments or at a time when you have a moment, it's not the amount of time that you use to actually practice. It's the regularity and getting, in that state of mind. So, any other comments about that, Nance or Khadijah? Okay. Next question. Oh, this has to do with conflict. What are coping skills for yelling? How do you handle difficult situations? And how do you heal mentally and emotionally?
Well, I mean, typically yelling is a sort of instantaneous response for when you're triggered, right? And so I think some of the things we just talked about in terms of strategies for managing that is to pause for a moment and take a breath and, do your own sort of internal speaking. Is this something that I really need to react to right now? Is this something that's important to me? How can I just take a minute to calm myself down? Because typically when we yell, we don't think first. We're just sort of blurting out something that has come to us impulsively and quickly. So taking a moment to just pause and breathe usually can help to de-escalate something that turns into yelling. Because we all know when we yell, the person that we're yelling at is usually just hearing wah 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 wah. So if we really want to get our message across, take a minute, and then you'll be able to hopefully say it in a calmer way that people can hear.
That's great. Khadijah, you're muted.
Thank you. The other thing I think that happens is we're frustrated, and then we're also moving way too fast. And I think one of the techniques that we talk about often is really this whole calm technique, where you really stop what you're doing, which is the slow down, and you really just take a minute and connect with your child and give them your undivided attention. You identify how they're feeling, so it looks like you're feeling sad or angry, and then you listen. You actively listen to hear what they're talking about, what they're telling you about how they're feeling, what maybe has happened. And then you sit with them, and you allow them to have whatever feeling, emotion they're having. And you sit with them and you tolerate it, and you don't try to problem solve, you just allow them to be. And so I think when we first slow down, we can kind of engage in that process, which will minimize the yelling by a lot.
The second part of the question had to do with how to heal mentally and emotionally. And I might add to what you two have said is to have frequent conversations. If there are conflicts, not to assume that you know what another person is feeling or reacting. So that has to do with your notion of validation. It's, we humans, as I mentioned before, need each other. We're pack animals. So if you're feeling disconnected, even using digital media to stay in contact with people who you love and care about, whether they're family members or siblings or spiritual leaders, clergy, teachers, folks that you can connect with to help you get through the hard times. I think those are other elements that can help, hold you and calm you down. And there are plenty of other ways of lengthening the fuse. When they say, when you said, Nance, pause, you know, counting to 10 is, you know, or with a kid, giving them a timeout. It's not a punishment, but just time to sit and reflect on what's upsetting me. And taking the time to do that is often very helpful.
I think, what you were talking about in terms of listening to your child and what you just said, Jean, about giving them time, you know, the way we do that with our children obviously will be different if you're working with a 2-year-old or a 10-year-old or an 18-year-old, right? Or a 20-year-old who's now home, who may have been away at school. But I think the principles remain. It's sort of how you do it and the way in which you have those conversations that will be different. But the underlying premise, I think, holds true across the age span.
Yeah,
I agree.
oh, go ahead, Khadija. I'm sorry.
I was just saying, I agree.
Yeah, you know, there's another thing that we tend to do when we're yelling, and that is to point the finger, cast blame. Be aware that everybody's stressed, and screaming, yelling, blaming another is really not going to be helpful. It's like wow, 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 like what you were saying. It's no one's going to be listening to that. So it's really a mistake to blame others and think about what's pushing your button. So just another point of view. Excuse me. Now another question that came in: what are some ways to motivate a parent caregiver to get professional help when it's needed? Now I assume this means when one is not likely or interested or willing. Let's add that in to make it even a bigger challenge. How do we motivate? If we notice that a parent, or if anybody in the family notices that a parent needs professional help, how do we motivate them to get it?
The stigma is great. And sometimes I think having someone, because like you've said several times, we're pack animals, we're meant to be together with people. Often if you are warm and compassionate and maybe offer to go with them, that could mean a whole lot, because the other thing is people are scared, so they don't know what to expect. Again, because of the stigma, that can go a long ways in motivating someone to get help if they're resistant.
I would also say that I think there's a difference between needing to get professional help and needing support. And there's many ways, maybe the question is perhaps putting the cart before the horse. Are there ways in which we can get support? I'll go back to something I read almost every day when we talk about supporting adolescents or college age students during the pandemic. And we keep focusing on how important connections are, especially in that developmental period. Well, as you mentioned earlier, connections are important throughout our lives, right? So we always say, oh, make sure your kids are still connecting with their friends and their peers. Do they have chat rooms? Do they have opportunities to get together on Zoom? Well, are you doing that for yourself as parents or caregivers? Are you gathering with friends or family members virtually, or, usually virtually, to get sort of the support that you might normally have gotten if you saw, a coworker in the break room and you're saying, oh my God, last night my child, blah, 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 and you have a little bit of exchange. It's a connection and a support. I think starting with some of those things makes perhaps getting professional help, if you need it, a little bit less intimidating. It's sort of a step. Um, and also acknowledging, look, these things are normal. We're all experiencing these things. And when they get to a point that our normal ways of coping can't deal with anymore, so you need a little bit of extra help. I mean, you're not alone, I guess, is the point that I'm trying to make. Back to your point about stigma, that we're all struggling. And sometimes the stars just align in a way that our normal support structures don't do the trick anymore. We try those, and then if we need more, there you
That
go.
that, that validation is so helpful.
Yeah. And for the audience, there's for high school and for some college students, there's the Students Against Destructive Decisions, which is a peer support based group. And these are kids helping kids, and they're all under supervision. And in colleges, Active Minds is an organization that uses peer support. So, there are models for peer support that you were referring to, Nance, that are out there, and they can be very helpful. Um, and I want to get back to what Khadijah was saying about stigma. Is that um, I think one of the things that we all need to kind of work on is diminishing the barriers for seeking a consultation in mental health. I mean, you know, um, folks don't realize it, but you know, 1 in 4 individuals during the course of their life will have a mental health uh, problem or crisis, a problem, a psychiatric disorder, and that's incredibly high. I mean, it's more common, for example, among adults than strep throat, um, and yet there's a strong reluctance to seek that. So, what I would say is, if you're talking to somebody about getting some professional help, um, it doesn't mean that you know that they're doomed or it's a black mark on their. See, oftentimes stigma, and it's different with different cultural groups too, which we could talk about, but folks often feel that getting mental health help means that there's something wrong with them as a person, that they won't get better, that that uh, that they're going to be
A
plagued
week.
problem for life. And the data, the research shows actually that getting professional help, mental health, is about as effective as most medical conditions. But we don't realize that oftentimes, and there's such shame associated with it. And that's where I think, Nance, your comment about peer support is really important, and Khadijah, your notion of validation and listening is really important as well.
I just want to, so you talk about the stigma around seeking mental health treatment. There's so much stigma around just talking about it between friends or between, amongst ourselves. So I think that's the other area that we really need to focus, because we're not alone and we're all struggling. And it's okay to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think, back to not comparing yourself to others, and we assume that others aren't struggling. But when you do open up the conversation, it's quite astonishing to learn just how many of us are struggling. I also often think of, when we talk about college students needing to take a break away from school because they're struggling with an emotional health issue, oftentimes they feel like they have failed somehow if they have to take time away or they have to go get treatment. And I think the same feeling is probably true for many people who are apprehensive about getting treatment. And we try to encourage students and schools to applaud those people who are wise enough to know that they need to get some help. It doesn't mean even that you have a psychiatric diagnosis or a mental health disorder. We all have garden variety issues that we could benefit from, sometimes from professional help. So we got to turn that message around and really applaud the wisdom of people for knowing when they need to reach out and get some help, as opposed to feeling that they've somehow failed.
Well, what's interesting is we as parents and grandparents and caregivers should really, look to the younger people. Um, um, while and this is really interesting, um, while the millennials and Gen Z have more depression, anxiety, stress, and loneliness than any other generation, which is the bad news. The good news is that they're more open to talking about it than almost any other generation. And maybe that's why the numbers are so high, because it may be an artifact of their being open to talk about depression, anxiety, stress, suicidal thinking, loneliness, but they're open to talking about it, and that's really positive. So I think we can learn something from them in terms of their willingness to kind of be open about the forces in their life that are causing stress and anxiety.
Yeah, every study shows, and all of the schools we work with, that stigma is clearly on the decline among young people. It's people in my generation and, maybe a couple below me, that are still holding on to the stigma. So and that's unfortunate because as the adult role models, we are reinforcing something that really our younger folks in our world are recognizing um, in a much more positive way. So we need to wake up.
So the next question is, are there support groups for fathers in Massachusetts? Assuming parenting emotional support groups like there are for moms. And we will provide a resource list, but Khadijah, do you know of any?
I don't know of any in particular, no.
Well, we'll look around. I know that at the MGH, one resource that we'll list is Ray Levy has the Fatherhood Project, and I'm sure if anybody knows about support groups for fathers in Massachusetts, we can do that. And if anybody in the audience knows of support groups, send it in, because I know that this is not limited to Massachusetts or New York, but all over the country. But support groups are really very important. Okay, send in your questions, everybody. I have a couple more. The impact of COVID-19 on students with disabilities has been enormous, and the parents to manage the unmanageable with school. So, what is the impact of COVID-19 on students with disabilities?
I mean, so one of the big impacts is really being out of the school building and not being able to get your services, whether they're speech services, whether you're getting counseling at schools, occupational therapy, physical therapy. You're not there getting those services because you're home, and depending on your what your resources are, you may not even have internet to be able to connect, to be able to maybe get those remotely if they can be delivered remotely. So I think being out of the school building, not being connected to resources, is one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, I was actually reading a bit about this the other day, in terms of, what schools are doing to provide whatever services they can virtually. It's clearly not the same, and especially things like physical therapy, it's just not going to happen. Some speech things, some things you can do virtually, but in terms and so looking at the IEP and taking a look at what are the things that we can transition to virtually. It doesn't mean that everything goes out the window because you're no longer in the school building, right? So what from the IEP can we be doing virtually to keep going? And then to your point about if you don't have internet, I was reading, I'm not sure if it's law, so don't quote me on this, but that's for schools who have students who require a device of some sort, whether it's a computer or voice activated, that the school at least is expected. I'm not sure if they're required to provide that device. It certainly doesn't take away from the enormous challenge that you mentioned, which is just blatant. But it doesn't mean to say that everything goes out the window either. There has to be some things that can stay in place, and school does continue to have to provide within
And and
reason.
all and also having the IEP, I encourage a lot of parents to have their IEP modified for remote learning. So, the other thing, some kids had one-to-one support to help them stay on task and to help them get work done. And if parent is working at home, that's almost impossible for them to do. So how do they adjust the accommodations to match what it is they're actually doing?
Yep.
I think it's especially difficult for parents that don't have English as a first language, for families that are essential workers that can't be home to help homeschool. Um, for families, like 16% of Boston does not have internet. And imagine a kid with a developmental disability that can't use the internet. Um, and remote learning is distracting. So we've got to be creative. I think what I recommended to a number of the parents that I've had is that if your kids are in public school, they're required to provide accommodations if there's an IEP or special accommodations, and the school really does need to provide that. Now there is an incredible burden on teachers, so I mean, I feel bad about saying this, but having some folks at school providing extra time for the kids, to give them a little bit of extra help, especially for the parents that can't do that, is super important. And parents need to either be advocates or get somebody at school to be an advocate for them to get these needs met.
Well,
And not to be
no, go.
and not to be afraid to reach out to the teachers and say, this is not working. This is what we're doing and it's not working and I need some more guidance. It looks great on paper, but sometimes it doesn't work in real life. And just to speak to how do you kind of manage your emotions when you're frustrated, I think it just goes back to some of the things we talked about earlier around giving yourself a break, and celebrating the wins that happen in the day. So maybe you didn't get through math, English, and science, but you were able to get through social studies and celebrate the wins.
Yeah. And I think we need to be realistic about the fact that certainly for students that need accommodations, but all students, there's going to be a period of remediation. I mean, we have to be realistic that many students are not going to learn in the same way or develop the same skills and knowledge base as they would have within classroom instruction, whether that's students with disabilities or any student. But especially for students with disabilities, like where's the remediation? How are we planning for remediation and catch up when students return to in-person instruction? And I think that's something that maybe folks are just beginning to think about now as we're thinking about returning to in-person instruction. But we can't expect that the students are going to get back into the classroom and pick up where they left off, because that's likely, an unrealistic expectation.
So thanks. One of the other things that a lot of parents have worried about is, will they ever be able to catch up? Will they lose out on their development, especially social emotional learning for kids that have social issues? And the answer is that there's always the opportunity to catch up, as long as as what you were saying, Nance, is that we're monitoring where the gaps are, where the social, emotional, behavioral, cognitive gaps are, and we keep track of them, and we help with the teachers keeping track of them, they'll catch up. So another question. Hi, in terms of prioritizing time for yourself, working out, reading, whatever makes you feel good, if you have to get up earlier and stay up later to work, do you recommend that, or is sleep a better use of our time?
That's a tough one.
Well, from someone who goes to bed at 8:30, I'd say sleep's the top priority for me. I mean, sleep is self-care in many, many ways, I think. And if you're having to get up at 6 and go to bed at 2 because your workplace is not being flexible or accommodating to the fact that you may have time during the day where you need to spend helping your remote learning children, or you have an aging parent or a sick family member, then it strikes me that that is a conversation to have with your workplace, because those hours are untenable and certainly would lead to burnout.
Yeah.
And self-care can be varying times. So, in terms of what you want to do, I do think it's super important to schedule it because it can be one of these things that we get into the trap of there's no time for this. But it doesn't have to be an hour. It depends on, if you could squeeze it in. Um, Carving out 10 minutes to do meditation could be helpful. It could be self-care.
And in terms of sleep for parents, I mean, one of the things that we haven't talked about is kids' need and parents' need for structure. So what I recommend to my patients is that take 7 days a week and structure it as if you would a school day. So when is wake up time? When is breakfast time? When is um, school time? When is homework time? When is a break time? When is running around outside if you have a yard, in the yard, so structure, structure, structure. And frankly, if going to bed, if getting sleep, which is super important, um, is built into the schedule, maybe you all go to sleep earlier. I mean, what I've done um, is I've gone to sleep earlier, but I've also gotten up earlier, an hour or two early, because if I get up an hour or two earlier, then I can get some stuff done in the very early morning hours. Now, I was always a night owl, but during COVID, I've gone to bed at 8 or 9 o'clock as opposed to 11 or 12 o'clock, and I've gotten up at 4:30 or 5. May sound crazy, but it's part of a structure that works.
I think one of the challenges is when you have younger children that need you during that school day because they're normally in school while you're working. But now you're having to be with them, especially the younger ones that have maybe 4 or so hours a day of schooling. And then they need childcare if they're 3, 4, 5, or 6. So then when do you do your work if you're employed, right? You start at when they go to bed. I mean, that's where I'm talking about their needs. I think we need to sort of reevaluate whether you're working for a college or a high school or, a business or whatever. What are our expectations of employees and how do we need to modify that a bit
Right.
um, to accommodate the anomaly we're facing?
Yeah. So another question here. Um, Advocate for local college students to volunteer to provide remedial assistance. I,
I think
I'll tell you, I've recommended that, and I see a number of college students, and it does a couple of things. I think first of all, um, during COVID, a number of the college students actually have the time to do that. They're capable of doing that, um, uh, and contributing and giving, providing help. Now, I would recommend that the college student. I've recommended to my college students that I see that they talk with the teacher because they're not special ed teachers. But this is not a matter of necessarily being a special ed teacher. It may be providing the same kind of assistance that a parent might provide, and it may just help the kid, get over a hump.
It also helps the college student to feel like they're contributing, right? They're making a contribution, they're productive, they're helping someone. I mean, I think that's a win-win. It's
Mhm.
a win for both the person who's providing the support and the person who's receiving the support.
Yeah,
and
it's
it gives them
interesting.
a sense of purpose. They
Yeah.
they have a sense of purpose.
Yes, it's interesting and important to note that giving is better than receiving. And when we give and contribute, it releases oxytocin in the brain, which is the chemical in the brain that makes us feel closer to people. So, while we all like to get gifts and, and receive things, what you said, Nance, is that it's so true, is that contributing is really important. So, a couple other questions. Um, I'm wondering what recommendations regarding self care looks like for single parents who hold multiple jobs and competing priorities between caring for multiple family members. A tough one.
Big challenge. I mean, first of all, just validating how difficult it is to navigate all of what was described in the question single-handedly, right? And so likely that's almost an impossible task. And so who do you have in your network that you might be able to turn to for some support, whether it's a friend or a family member or a neighbor, or, I'm thinking about when the pandemic first started and a lot of students were home, but parents were still working outside of the home. And so how were they going to manage their kids at home when they couldn't be there? And, many folks I know reached out to other parents so that they each took a day if they could. And so my day might be Monday where I had all the kids. And you're not supposed to really do that but you keep them kind of in separate rooms or as far apart as you can. But it's just one example of how can you use neighbors, neighborhoods, family members, you know, get support from the school, however you clergy, where in your neighborhood can you go or in your circle or your network to get whatever support you can for even a short period of time, because it's really probably going to take a village to do this, especially if you're trying to do it on your own.
And I think what is also important, and I think it's similar to what you said, is just the acceptance that this is going to be tough and you can't do everything. So kind of giving yourself a break, uh, figuring out what things are going to have to go, what things will you do a little bit less of, and really kind of finding that balance. Because without that, you're trying to do too much and the burnout will be super fast. The other thing I think, and what you also mentioned earlier, is the planning in advance. The planning in advance will be helpful in terms of getting in front of like tantrums, be helpful in terms of allowing you to organize your day and allowing the kids to have their day organized as well. And I think it would help a lot and for a lot of different reasons in a lot of different areas.
One other group that we shouldn't forget are grandparents. Many of us, I'll include myself, are home, have been home, and can be great assistance. I mean, so Nance, what you suggested in terms of using anybody that you possibly can in the community and in your network is awesome. But let's not forget that grandparents are around and really want to both connect. It's another win-win. They connect with their grandchildren, they connect with their children, and they're doing something that can be super helpful if they're capable of that. Another question. Generally speaking, parents don't prioritize their health or well-being above their children's. Their children generally come first. What are some things parents and children can do together to improve their own and each other's health and well-being? I appreciate the tip on structuring and scheduling.
There's tons of things you can do together. Meditate together, deep breathe together, work out together. That the list is endless. And anytime I think that you can combine the two, which is awesome because you're spending time, quality time, you're modeling and teaching, self-care, and both of you or however many kids there are, everyone's getting the benefit.
And fun things like, playing board games, watching a movie, cooking a meal, sort of the normal day-to-day things that you do anyway, thinking, well, maybe not board games every day, but, cooking a meal or, things that are your daily things, doing them together. Many skills can be learned in having your children or your young people in your home doing things with you. They may not care for doing the laundry, but they'll learn how to fold sheets.
It's necessary.
One of the things that I've done with and I'm just thinking of all of because I see a lot of kids and parents, creative things like learning an instrument together, like journaling, like writing poetry, like well, my family, for example, when COVID began, or when we were in lockdown, a couple months later, we created a Spotify quarantine playlist, and everybody, including the young children, and I mean, the 3 and 4 year olds, contributed a song, so that we amassed a song of, that we would all contribute. But doing things together learning, that are creative, um, I think are really valuable. So there's so many things that we can do together.
Jean, I hope your Spotify playlist did not include Baby Shark.
No, that was actually forbidden. But actually,
Good.
it's interesting. I have kids who are uh, who are into uh, good children's music. But um, turns out that my uh, 3.5-year old contributed um, uh, the Banana Boat song, and actually her favorite song back then was Georgia, and the only version she would listen to was Ray Charles. So I was thrilled because I didn't want to hear Baby Shark, but I can listen to Ray Charles all day long. So okay, so we got another one. What if there are 4 people in a household, 2 adults, 2 children, and you all like doing different activities on your own time? I do not like watching Netflix, but my spouse and children do.
Well, obviously, there's room for negotiation, right? You need to, everyone, back to the planning, who's going to get to do what when, right? We're not, unless you each have your own device, which is probably unlikely in a household of 4, although for some that might be viable. Then you each have your own device, you can do what you want. But if not, and you're sharing, then obviously planning and negotiating who's going to get what at what time. Jean, I was just noticing in the chat, the last question that they wanted us to address about how do parents manage relationships with young adults and college
Yeah.
students to move back home. And
Yeah.
Can I answer? Can I
yeah,
answer?
you go.
Well, yeah, because you have
Because
a real life experience with that.
he was so miserable in March when he came home. It was unbelievable. But it approaching it with warmth and empathy is really big. Remembering that they were once living on their own and somewhat independently without you, without your kind of super keen oversight. And that it's hard for them too. They don't want to be here. They've lost their social connections. They've lost what they had dreamed of as their college and campus experience. So I think when you start in that way, your interactions can be much more productive and positive. But I think the biggest thing that you can do is include them as collaborators or solvers with you in terms of thinking about renegotiating the house rules. What house rules have to stay? Which ones will you be a little bit more lenient on? But I think doing those things together, recognizing again, they were on their own once and now they're home, and how that might feel is a great way and a great place to start.
That's so true. I mean, they've been living independently, right? So you can't take that completely away when they come home. At the same time, it's helpful for them to understand what your boundaries are. And so, what do you need? What do I need? And how can we come to a place
Right.
together that we can mutually agree upon would work for now? And I also can't stress enough your point about really empathizing with all of the losses that they have, loss of a college experience, loss of friends, loss of the independence. I have heard, some parents say, oh, this will be over soon, or, oh, it's not so bad. That's not going to fly. I mean, really accepting it and acknowledging that this is a difficult time for them. And so to your point as well, how much leeway can we give them within boundaries that we can also accept?
There's also the issue with college students about what's called anticipatory grief. So not only had they lost all of these milestones that you've mentioned, Nance, but they're anticipating further losses in the future. Getting a job, getting an internship, um, uh, you know, uh, how will they
Taking a year off.
taking a year off, right? So what do I do for this gap year? There is a question about that, which I'll just come to in a second. But also the anticipatory group about what if I'm not vaccinated and I get somebody sick who who's older and who's infirm. So there's lots of worries that they have, and we need to reassure them that um, that we can help them and listen to them and validate them and help them, make these decisions. The other question, yep, sorry, go ahead, Nance.
I was just gonna say, also living with uncertainty. I mean, am I going back to class? Am I not going back to class? Am I going for a week? Am I going to be there for a month? That uncertainty, and we can't tell them what's going to be because we don't know ourselves. So acknowledging that living with uncertainty breeds, some level of anxiety.
Well, and the last question I have right here, and then we have to wind down, is, related, and it's how do I help my college student decide what to do next? To take a year off, to take a gap year? How can they? What will help them in making these difficult decisions?
I mean, I go back to the old fashioned pros and cons list by fours. So the pros of taking a gap year, the cons of taking a gap year, the pros of continuing, the cons of continuing. I mean, that's a good place to start. And then that gives you a place to expand the conversation.
And there's one, I guess, a new question. They keep coming in. Have you seen some social support structures that have started to grow during the pandemic that should become more permanent support structures? What positive solutions have already been started that could be grown and continued?
I guess I think more of things in the workplace that I've seen in terms of supporting staff and faculty in a school system around flexibility, around beginning to acknowledge staff as whole people and not just worker bees, and some of the policy change and flexibility in routines and work times that have emerged that I hope will continue. Um, uh, you know, I think that there's much that we've learned from the pandemic and the changes we've had to make that we could sustain, and I hope we do. And I think a lot of those focus around how we can change the culture of the workplace.
Well, I think we have to wrap up. I want to thank you all for taking time to join us today. And thank you for all you do for the young people in our life. Remember to take care of yourself too. And as we say at the Clay Center at the end of all of our podcasts, we hope that our conversation will help you have yours. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Nance, and
Thank you.
thanks.
Thanks for having me.